I never thought a simple dinner invitation could change the way I saw myself or my life. But that night, something shifted. Something small, but undeniable. Looking back, I realize now it wasn't really about the dinner. It was about being seen, really seen, for the first time in what felt like years. I was 58, and my life had fallen into a rhythm so quiet, I hadn't even noticed how silent it had become. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. There was comfort in the routine. Yes, but also a kind of numbness. I had stopped expecting surprises, stopped expecting anything, really. My job at the law firm was steady. I'd been there for nearly 15 years, and though I wasn't in the spotlight, I was dependable. I handled the details no one noticed unless they were wrong. I stayed late when no one asked. I made sure things didn't fall apart. I was, as people often said, reliable. That word had started to feel like a quiet dismissal. My boss, Daniel Hayes, was the kind of man people naturally respected. In his early 60s, tall with silver-streaked hair, he had a calm confidence that made people listen when he spoke. He wasn't flashy or loud, just steady, sharp, always in control. We worked closely, but our relationship had always been strictly professional. So when he stopped by my desk one Friday afternoon and casually said, "I'm hosting a small dinner tomorrow night. Would you like to come?" I was caught completely off guard. At first, I thought he meant it as a polite gesture, something he probably offered to others in the office. But when I hesitated, he added, "It's nothing formal. Just some good food, quiet conversation. I'd enjoy your company." I said yes. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe loneliness. Maybe because no one had asked me to dinner in longer than I cared to admit. And next day, I spent far too long choosing what to wear. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just dinner at a colleague's house, nothing more. But I still smoothed my blouse 3 extra times before knocking on his door. Daniel lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. His home was tasteful, minimalist, filled with worn lighting and shelves lined with books instead of gadgets. There was a faint scent of rosemary and garlic in the air, and soft instrumental music played in the background. It wasn't what I expected. It felt peaceful. He greeted me with a glass of wine and that same steady presence. We started with small talk, the office, weekend plans, books. But somewhere between the salad and the main course, something changed. Daniel began asking questions no one had asked me in years. What did I enjoy outside of work? What dreams had I set aside? Did I ever think about doing something else with my time? They weren't intrusive questions, just thoughtful, deliberate. And more than that, he actually listened to my answers. Not the way people pretend to listen, nodding while checking their phone. He listened like my words had weight. I felt the air shift. Not in a romantic way, not yet. But in a human way. In the kind of way that makes your heart quietly ache. Not because someone loves you, but because they notice you're still here. It had been a long time since anyone looked at me without looking through me. Later, as I stood by the window sipping wine, Daniel joined me, standing just close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. "You know," he said quietly, not looking at me, "you hold everything together, at work, probably outside of it too. People don't always realize what that costs." I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. But something inside me softened, cracked open just a little. We didn't stay late. We didn't hug goodbye. But the silence that lingered after I left felt louder than anything either of us had said. I drove home in the dark, headlights flickering against the wet pavement, wondering why my chest felt so full and so empty at the same time. That night, lying awake in bed, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I felt important to someone. And somehow, that simple dinner, those few hours, had reminded me of something I didn't know I'd lost. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely begun to filter through the blinds, but I was already sitting at the edge of the bed, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee and staring out the window. Something about last night wouldn't leave me alone. It wasn't the food, though it was delicious. It wasn't the wine or the way the jazz music floated softly in the background. It was the way Daniel had looked at me. Or maybe more accurately, the fact that he had looked at me at all, not as his assistant, not as the dependable woman who made sure his meetings ran smoothly and his papers were signed. He looked at me as if I were a person, a whole person, with layers, with a life. I didn't know how long it had been since I felt that. At the office, I tried to slip back into my usual rhythm. I kept my voice calm and polite, my demeanor neutral. I focused on reports, schedules, and filing deadlines, but my mind drifted more often than I liked to admit. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't act any differently. He was just as professional, just as composed. But there was something subtle in the way he greeted me that morning. Something quiet in his smile. I noticed it because I had started noticing everything. I thought the feeling would fade after a few days, that I'd return to my routine, brush off the strange weight in my chest, and move on. But instead, the opposite happened. It grew. It was in the way my fingers lingered on my coffee mug a little longer in the mornings, thinking of how he had noticed the ring I always wore and asked about its story. It was in the way I caught myself replaying our conversation, how he had listened without interruption, how he had said I was the one holding everything together. Those words had nestled somewhere deep in my chest, not because they were dramatic or romantic, but because they were real. Thoughtful. Unexpected. It had been years since anyone spoke to me like that. Evenings became the hardest. I used to find comfort in the quiet. Now it felt loud. The silence of my house, the emptiness of my kitchen, the sound of the television humming just to fill the air, it all felt heavier somehow. I would glance at the same recipe book Daniel used and wonder if he was cooking alone that night too. A week later, he stopped by my desk with a folder in hand. "I made too much again," he said casually, like he hadn't been rehearsing it in his head. "There's some leftover risotto in the office fridge if you'd like to take it home. Don't feel obligated." I smiled, keeping it small. "Thanks, that's kind of you." But that risotto sat heavier in my bag than I expected. It felt like a piece of something passed quietly between us, without need for explanation. A soft continuation of whatever had started that night. I ate it alone in my kitchen, the same one that always felt too quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel entirely alone. It wasn't just food. It was the thought behind it, the awareness, the quiet gesture that said, "I see you." What unsettled me most wasn't that Daniel had done something kind. It was how deeply I responded to it, how that small kindness echoed louder than any grand gesture ever had. I started to see him differently, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't help it. His steadiness, his thoughtful nature, his quiet humor, they had always been there, but now I noticed them. And I realized something else. I missed being noticed in return, not for my work or reliability, but for who I was underneath all of that. I hadn't been touched in years, not just physically, but emotionally. No one had reached that far into me, gently and without force, simply to say, "You matter." I didn't know what to do with that kind of tenderness. I didn't know how to carry it. So instead, I went to work. I stayed polite. I smiled. I answered emails. But inside, a door had opened. And no matter how much I tried to close it again, the air on the other side was already beginning to pull me through. A few days passed, then a week. And though nothing direct was said between us, everything still felt different. We were still co-workers. We still discussed projects, timelines, and contracts. But there was something else now. A quiet undercurrent that lingered in every shared glance, every pause too long between sentences, every moment when neither of us spoke. But neither of us wanted to walk away either. I started to notice things I never paid attention to before. The way Daniel's eyes softened when he asked if I was getting enough rest. The way he stood a little closer when we looked at something on my screen. The way his voice grew quieter when he spoke just to me, as if he was saying something meant only for my ears. And then, one evening, he sent me an email. It wasn't formal, not like the ones we exchanged daily. No subject line, just one short message. If you ever feel like another quiet dinner, my door's open. That was all it said. Nothing pushy, no expectations, just an open door. I stared at it for a long time before replying. I even closed the tab, got up from my desk, made tea, and came back, only to read it again. The words were simple, but something about them made my hands shake slightly as I typed my response. I'd like that. I hit send before I could overthink it. I didn't know what this was becoming. I didn't even know what I wanted it to be, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. That Saturday, I found myself standing outside his door again. This time, I didn't agonize over what to wear, but I still caught myself adjusting my blouse 3 times before ringing the bell. Daniel greeted me with the same warm presence, but his eyes held something new, something like quiet anticipation, as if he too was wondering where this was headed. Dinner was simple: a roast chicken, some roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine already open, no candles, no background music, just conversation. But unlike the first dinner, the silences between us weren't filled with nerves or uncertainty. They felt peaceful, full, like we were both comfortable with not needing to fill the air with words. He asked me about my childhood, something no one had brought up in years. I told him about the small town I grew up in, the way my mother used to hang sheets on the line in the summer sun, the way I used to sit on the porch with my dad and count cars as they passed. It wasn't dramatic or profound, but it was real. And he listened as if it mattered. When I returned the question, he opened up more than I expected. He spoke of his first years building the firm, of losing a friend to cancer in his 40s, of how, despite being surrounded by people, he often felt alone. Not lonely, just unshared. That word stayed with me, unshared, because I felt the same. I had a life, a house, a job, but how much of it did I actually share with anyone? At some point, after we finished our meal and moved to the couch with our drinks, I found myself laughing at something he said. Not just a polite chuckle, but an unguarded, full laugh that made me realize how long it had been since I let myself be light. And Daniel looked at me in a way that made the laughter catch in my throat. He didn't smile right away. He just looked, like he was memorizing the moment, like he saw something I had forgotten existed in me. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the strange ache of being seen. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The warmth of the wine, the quiet of the house, the glow from the lamp in the corner, it all seemed to wrap around us like a blanket we hadn't asked for, but welcomed anyway. And in that silence, something happened. Not a kiss, not even a touch, but a stillness, a shared understanding that something was growing here, whether we named it or not. When I left that evening, he walked me to my car. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't say anything unnecessary. He simply stood there, watching me buckle in, offering a soft good night through the window. As I drove away, I felt both full and fragile, because what we were building wasn't based on grand gestures or declarations. It was built on presence, on the slow, steady unfolding of 2 people who had forgotten what it felt like to be quietly important to someone. The following week at the office felt unusually quiet, not in the literal sense. Phones still rang, keyboards clicked, meetings came and went. But inside me, there was a strange hush, a space that hadn't been there before, as if something had shifted inward, and I was still adjusting to the new shape of it. Daniel didn't mention the dinner. He didn't need to. We moved through the days with the same professionalism as always, but something had changed in the way we existed around each other. There was a softness now, a wordless awareness. He didn't linger at my desk. He didn't send more emails. But when our eyes met across a conference table, there was something unspoken there. A quiet check-in, a pause in time, and somehow that meant more than words. I started to notice how easy it was to fall into step with him, not just at work, but in the rhythm of being understood. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to make small talk. With Daniel, silence was not emptiness. It was permission to simply be. One evening, near the end of the day, I stayed behind to finish a set of files. Most of the office had already gone home, and the building had that rare, peaceful stillness that only came after hours. I didn't know he was still there until I heard his voice behind me. "You always stay longer than you should." I turned, startled but not unsettled. He was standing in the doorway of my office, jacket slung over his shoulder, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked tired, but in that way that made a person seem more human, not less. "Habit," I replied with a small smile. He leaned against the door frame. "You don't have to do more than what's asked of you." I paused, unsure how to respond. For so many years, I had built my value on exactly that: doing more, being the dependable one, the one who didn't need recognition or thanks, the one who kept things going quietly, without fanfare. But standing there with him, in the stillness of that near-empty office, I realized something. I didn't want to be invisible anymore. I didn't say that, of course. But I think he saw it anyway. He stepped forward just enough to bridge the space between us, without making it obvious. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the hallway. "Let me walk you out." The ride down in the elevator was quiet, but not awkward, not heavy, just full of something unspoken. We walked together to the parking lot, his steps falling into rhythm beside mine. The sky was soft and gray, the evening air thick with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. When we reached my car, I turned to say goodbye, and something in his expression made me pause. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He was just looking. And not at my clothes or my face, but at me. I felt something stir in my chest. A mix of nerves, warmth, fear, and anticipation. It wasn't romantic, not in the typical sense, but it was intimate, profoundly so. Because that gaze, that silence between us, said everything neither of us had dared to admit out loud. "I see you." Not as an assistant, not as a woman past her so-called prime. Not as the one who always stayed late and never asked for more. Just me. As I was. As I had been quietly hoping someone might see me again. We didn't hug. We didn't touch. But the way he looked at me in that moment felt more intimate than either. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I just sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, letting the stillness settle. I didn't know what this thing between us was. We hadn't named it. We hadn't defined it. But I knew what it wasn't. It wasn't casual. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't nothing. It was becoming something, slowly. Gently, almost imperceptibly. And I wasn't ready to stop it. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope I didn't know I'd stepped onto. Everything around me looked the same. I still arrived at the office at 8:30. I still brewed my tea the same way. I still sat at the same desk with the same tasks. But inside, something was unraveling. And not in a destructive way. In a quiet, almost graceful way. Like a thread slowly coming loose from a tightly woven sweater. A part of me was being revealed again. A part I had tucked away so long ago, I'd stopped noticing its absence. It wasn't that I was falling in love with Daniel. At least, not in the way books or movies describe it. There were no fireworks. No sleepless nights filled with fantasies. What I felt was gentler, heavier. Like being pulled toward a memory I hadn't lived yet, but somehow recognized. It was terrifying, because once you start to feel again, you also start to notice what's been missing. and I had been missing a lot. The most surprising thing wasn't how Daniel had made me feel seen. It was how little I had required to come alive again. Dinner. A few quiet words. A hand brushing near mine in the copy room. I wasn't hungry for passion. I was starving for presence. That realization cracked something open in me. One morning, while walking past a store window, I caught my reflection and didn't immediately look away. I noticed the soft lines in my face, gray streaks that had crept into my hair. But for once, I didn't judge them. I simply acknowledged them. This was me. This was a life, lived and still unfolding. And maybe, just maybe, there was more ahead than I had let myself believe. Daniel didn't reach out that week, not in any personal way, but I saw it in the little things. The way he waited for me at the elevator, even when it meant holding the door longer than he had to. The way he asked if I'd had lunch, not as a polite formality, but with real curiosity. He noticed me, constantly, quietly. And I noticed him too. But for all that noticing, I still hadn't allowed myself to admit out loud what was happening. Not even to myself. Because admitting it would mean acknowledging the risk, the vulnerability, the possibility that this gentle unfolding could one day come undone. Then came Thursday. I had stayed late again. Habit, as always. Daniel appeared in the doorway of my office without a word. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching me sort through papers I didn't really need to finish that night. I looked up, our eyes met, and in that moment, something fragile gave way inside me. I set the folder down. He stepped in. I was going to head out, he said softly, but I didn't want to leave without saying goodnight. I nodded, unable to find words. He stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough. Is everything all right? He asked. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say yes. But instead, I looked away and said, I'm not sure. A pause. The quiet hum of the office behind us. His voice again, lower this time. Are you afraid? That question sat between us like a mirror. I nodded. Barely. He didn't press. He just waited. And I whispered, I'm afraid to feel too much. I'm afraid to want something at this stage in my life. I'm afraid of what it would mean if I did. There, I had said it. Not a confession of love, not even desire, but truth. Raw and trembling. Daniel didn't offer reassurance. He didn't say it would be simple or safe. He just said, me too. Those two words broke me open, because they meant I wasn't alone. We stood there for a long moment, wrapped in nothing but silence and shared vulnerability. Then he smiled, the faintest curve of his lips. Let me walk you out. I gathered my things. We didn't talk on the way down. We didn't touch. But when we reached my car, he opened the door for me like it was second nature. As I sat down, he didn't say goodbye. He just said, take your time. I'm not going anywhere. And that night, for the first time in years, I let myself cry, not out of sadness, but out of release. Because someone had told me I didn't have to rush, that I didn't have to hide, that I could feel afraid and still be worth waiting for. I spent the weekend in a strange kind of quiet. Not the kind I used to hide behind, the kind that dulled everything around me. This was a different quiet, a stirring quiet. Like the air just before a summer storm, still, but charged with something waiting to be felt. I couldn't stop thinking about his words. Take your time, I'm not going anywhere. No one had ever said that to me before. Not like that. Not without strings or expectation. Just presence. Just patience. And it made me realize how long I'd gone without allowing anyone close enough to wait for me. That Sunday, I walked through my garden, the one I had neglected for months. The hydrangeas were overgrown. The lavender had leaned too far toward the sun. But in the middle of it all, something was still growing. I stood there with dirt on my palms and tears in my eyes because I understood something for the first time in a long while. I wasn't broken. I was still growing, too. Monday came, and with it, the usual hum of office life. But the hum didn't settle in me the way it used to. I found myself standing at the window of my office longer than necessary, watching cars pass, wondering how many people were just like me, going through the motions, waiting for permission to feel alive again. And then, late that afternoon, Daniel sent a message. Dinner? Just that. No context, no pressure. And without thinking, I replied, yes. This time, when I stood at his door, there was no hesitation in my hands, no adjusting of my blouse, no last-minute second-guessing. He opened the door, and the look on his face was different. Not cautious, not curious, just worn. We didn't speak much at first. We didn't need to. He made roasted vegetables and a simple pasta with olive oil and garlic. I brought a bottle of wine and a small tin of lemon cookies I had baked earlier that morning, something I hadn't done in years. He smiled when I handed it to him, and I felt a flicker of something light move through my chest. After dinner, we sat on the sofa, each with a glass of wine, the room lit only by a lamp in the corner. The space between us felt smaller than before, though neither of us had moved. And then he said something that stopped my breath. You don't have to pretend with me. Simple words, but they landed like a wave. Because I realized just how much pretending I'd done. Pretending to be fine, to be content, to not want more than what I had. I had made myself smaller for years, shrinking into roles that were safe, dependable, expected. But with Daniel, I didn't have to do that. I looked at him, really looked at him, the lines near his eyes, the steadiness in his posture, the way he held his glass, fingers relaxed, no tension in his shoulders. He was at ease with me, and that made me feel safe enough to speak. I haven't let anyone see me in a long time, I said, barely louder than a whisper. Not really. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He just waited. I thought if I kept my life small, I wouldn't lose anything, I continued. But I was wrong. I've lost time. I've lost parts of myself, and I'm tired of being invisible in my own life. The words didn't come out clean. They were messy, shaky, but they were mine. Daniel set his glass down, slowly, carefully, and then he reached for my hand. Not urgently, not possessively. Just gently. His fingers brushed mine, and something in me melted. I didn't pull away. I let him hold my hand. I let myself be still. I let myself feel the warmth of another human being who wasn't trying to fix me or impress me or own me, but simply wanted to be near me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't holding myself together. I was letting myself be held. We didn't talk much after that. We sat there hand in hand. The silence stretching comfortably between us. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't dared to believe. This, whatever it was not about starting over. It was about finally starting to live. The days after that night didn't feel like a beginning or an ending. They felt like a slow return, like waking up after a long, quiet sleep and realizing the world is still here, still waiting. Daniel and I didn't make any declarations. We didn't talk about what we were or where this was going. But something between us had shifted, permanently, quietly. A door had opened, and neither of us seemed in a hurry to close it. I started noticing how I walked through the world differently. Not in big dramatic ways. I didn't change my job or take up ballroom dancing. But I began to move with a kind of softness I hadn't known in years. I smiled more easily. I laughed without apology. I no longer felt the urge to disappear into rooms or silence myself in conversations. Something in me had come back to life. Daniel and I found small ways to stay close. An early morning coffee shared before the office woke up. A walk around the block after a long meeting. Quiet dinners, sometimes at his place, sometimes at mine. There was no rush, no pressure, just presence. And in that presence, I began to understand something that had eluded me for decades. That love, in its truest form, is not a spark. It's a steady flame. It doesn't demand. It doesn't overwhelm. It just stays, warm, constant, willing. One evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, thinking about how much I had changed. Not because someone had come into my life and swept me off my feet, but because someone had looked at me and simply said, without needing to say it, "You are enough." It's hard to put into words what that kind of recognition does to a woman who has spent years being needed but not noticed, heard but not listened to, present but unseen. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was fading. I felt like I was becoming. I remember the moment I knew this wasn't just about him, it was about me. I was standing in front of the mirror, brushing my hair, the way I had every morning for decades. But that morning, I paused. I looked, really looked, and I didn't flinch. I didn't focus on the wrinkles or the sag in my jawline. I didn't criticize the curve of my stomach or the softness in my arms. I looked into my own eyes and I saw someone I hadn't seen in a long, long time, me. And she was still here, still worthy, still beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth or smoothness or perfection. I saw a woman who had lived, who had loved, lost, endured, and kept going. A woman who had once been invisible even to herself, and now, finally, was standing in her own light. Daniel didn't fix me. He didn't save me. He simply reminded me of who I already was, and in doing so, gave me the space to rediscover myself. One night, as we sat together on the back porch, watching the sky melt into evening, I leaned my head against his shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just reached for my hand, fingers intertwining naturally with mine. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And I realized this is what I had been waiting for. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, just someone to share the quiet with. Someone who saw me exactly as I was and stayed. And maybe that's the most extraordinary thing of all. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, and leave a comment about your impression of this story. Thank you for watching.